Welcome, folks. As folks trickle in, we'll just wait a few moments to give everyone a minute to get in and get settled. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar on the Preservation League's Preservation Opportunity Fund, or POF for short. This is our first year launching this program, so we're really excited to share it with you and give you a little bit of information about it. So I know many of you are familiar with the Preservation League of New York State, but for those of you who may not be familiar with the League, who are joining us today, the Preservation League of New York State is the historic preservation nonprofit organization that serves the entire state of New York. We empower all New Yorkers to use historic preservation to enrich their communities, protect their heritage, and build a sustainable future. We do that through grants that many of you may be familiar with, through advocacy at the local, state, and national level. We provide technical assistance to all types of community members and property owners. If you have a question about an old building or an old place, you can always reach out to myself or my colleague Jana, who will be introducing herself in a moment. We have Preservation Excellence Awards. We draw attention to at-risk historic sites through our 7 to Save program. And we offer an excellent range of virtual programming through our Future of Preservation webinar series and our Preservation Book Club. So if you haven't heard of those, definitely check them out on our website. So again, my name is Caitlin Mivas. I'm the Director of Preservation at the League. I'm relatively new to this role. I've been here for a little over 3 months. You can reach out to me anytime via email, to talk about our grant programs, our 7 to Save program, or really anything preservation related. If you've got any kind of preservation question, you don't know where to begin, you've got a building, you don't know what the first step or the next step is, please feel free to reach out to me. And even though our League offices are headquartered in Albany, I am based in Rochester, Western New York. And I'll let Jana introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jana Rudler. I'm the Grants and Technical Services Manager at the Preservation League of New York State. You may be familiar with our Preserve New York and Technical Assistance Grant programs, and those are still ongoing, and I hope to see many of you at my in-person workshops coming up soon, but this is a new program, as Caitlin mentioned, and I'm also happy to answer your questions about it.
Great. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. So if you know someone who wasn't able to tune in or you have to duck out early, we will have that uploaded to our website on the Preservation Opportunity Fund webpage within a day or so. Captions are enabled. You can turn on captions through your Zoom taskbar at the bottom of your screen. And then if you have questions, we definitely encourage you, do not hesitate to ask them. You can drop your questions in the Q&A box. If you hover over that Zoom taskbar at the bottom, you will see a Q&A box and a chat box. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. That makes sure that we don't miss them and we can be sure to get to them. So again, drop those in at any point. We will keep an eye on them, and Jana will interject and interrupt me if a question pops up. We want to be sure to address it. And then, of course, we'll have time at the end for questions as well. So please do not hesitate to ask. And then if you want to keep up with the League's activities, you can follow us on Instagram at PreserveNYS is our main account. And then our colleague Katie Peace runs at Preservation Book Club on Instagram as well. And we are very pleased to offer continuing education credits to architects. This is a 1-hour webinar. So we are offering 1 CE credit for architects. This is through the New York State Education Department. So unlike credits through AIA, this is self-reporting. So we do not report or issue any kind of notice to New York State. That's up to you to do. We will issue you a certificate of completion. If you would like, you can email us to request that. And Jana has pasted those instructions in the chat, and she can also paste them in maybe one more time, Jana, for anyone who might have joined since you pasted it in the first time. And yeah, you can, if you need those, if all else fails, you can just reach out to myself or Jana or our grants@preservenys.org email address, and we'd be happy to take care of you and get you that certificate. And again, that's for architects and continuing education credits. Okay, so let's dive right in. Here's what we're going to cover today. Quick outline. We'll run through the basic information about the Preservation Opportunity Fund, which I am going to shorten to POF so that I'm not rolling out too many syllables. We'll talk about who is eligible to be an applicant, who's eligible to apply, what types of projects we can fund, what types of historic resources are eligible. We will run through our funding priorities for this new program. And we will also walk you through the application process, which is pretty straightforward. And then we'll end with some tips and frequently asked questions. And at the very end, again, we will open it up to Q&A. But again, I encourage you to drop your questions in the Q&A box as you have them. And Jana can monitor those, and she'll either respond in the chat or she'll interrupt me and we can address your questions. All right, let's get into it. So the basics of the Preservation Opportunity Fund. So the POF program is going to fund discrete capital projects, or what we often call bricks and mortar projects. So that means actual physical construction projects, physical repairs, restoration, preservation of your building or other type of historic resource. It's really meant for projects that are more or less shovel ready. So if you haven't done kind of the initial legwork to figure out what your building or historic site needs, you might not be ready for this first round of POF funding, but don't worry, we plan to have this program every year. So grants can be a minimum of $10,000 up to a maximum of $40,000. They require at least a 50-50 match. So if you are asking for $10,000 in funding, you need to be prepared to match that with at least $10,000 of your own cash. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Applicants must be 501c3 organizations. That's maybe the most important detail to take away. Not a 501c4, not a 501c13. You must be a 501c3 in order to apply. And in terms of the types of resources that are eligible for funding, can be a building, sites, structures, and objects. And we'll talk about what that means for anyone who might not be familiar with that terminology. And then the building has not just the building, the historic resource has to be accessible to the public, which basically just means it can't be a private home or like say a private business that isn't accessible and open to the public. Okay, so who are the eligible applicants? Like I said already, pretty straightforward. You must be a 501c3 nonprofit organization. That means you can be a preservation organization, you could be a museum or a historic site, you could even be a historic house of worship. You could also be any other number of types of 501c3s that I haven't listed here. You don't necessarily have to be a 501c3 that has like a history or preservation focus. As that 501c3 applicant, the other important piece is that you as the 501c3 must own the property that you're looking for funding for or have at least a 6-year lease. So you've got to be 501c3 and you have to own or have a long-term lease on the property. Entities that are not eligible, municipalities, state agencies, friends groups that steward state-owned buildings, school districts. So basically anything that's like a public entity Homeowners and private property owners, like a nonprofit, like a for-profit business or an LLC would not be eligible. Basically, anything that is not a 501c3 is not eligible to be an applicant. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so in terms of the types of projects that are eligible for funding, we use these different terms in the preservation profession to refer to the different types of treatments of historic properties. And we use the terms preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation, or rehab for short. So preservation is basically the maintenance, the normal maintenance and repair of the existing historic materials on your building or historic resource. Restoration is really reserved exclusively for museums. That's when you are depicting a property during a very specific period of time in its history. So you may be removing details or materials that have been added over time so that that property is restored to look exactly as it would have looked during whatever period of time you're interpreting at your historic site or museum. So again, when we talk about restoration, that's really just for museums. And then rehabilitation is the treatment that we see probably most often and that we advocate for most often. And that's taking a building, most often a building, and adapting it to a new compatible use through repair and preservation, sometimes also through sensitive alterations and even often modern additions, with the overall goal of retaining the property's historic character. So the POF program can fund any of these three approaches, whether it's a simple preservation repair project, if you're a museum and you have a restoration project, or let's say you have a vacant building that you're rehabbing to a new use.
Caitlin, we
Yes.
have a couple of questions about eligible applicants before we move forward. Okay, so does the resource need to be open to the public, full-time, regular hours, for free or for a paid admission, anything like that?
So yeah, folks who are familiar with our other grant programs, you might be familiar that we ask very specific questions about, how are you doing outreach to the public? How accessible is your site? We're not really that as concerned with those details with this program. It's just, is there some kind of public accessibility component? So if it's let's say it's a garden. If it's a garden like on a university campus that folks from the public can wander in and out of, maybe not 24/7, but if there's some kind of public accessibility component. So if it's a theater, obviously you can't walk into, well, let's say it's a theater owned and operated by a nonprofit, right? A 501c3. Obviously you can't walk in and out of there at any time of day, but it has some kind of publicly accessible component to it.
Okay. Also, are history centers that are exclusively municipally run excluded?
So if it's municipally, so the applicant, so again, the municipality absolutely could not apply, right? That's a straightforward answer. But if it was municipally owned and a 501c3 had a long-term lease on it, that 501c3 could be the applicant, but sounds like it's exclusively municipally run and there isn't some kind of ownership interest with a 501c3, then it sounds like it would not be eligible. But again, and if you've got specific situations, we can discuss them at the end or we can talk offline for sure.
Sure. And one other thing, is any 501c3 organization eligible to apply, or does the mission need to include preservation?
It does not. So any 501c3 is eligible.
Great.
All right, great questions.
Right. I have one more. Friends group. Okay, so here's one. We're a friends group in a county-owned historic house. We do not rent. We're a 501c3. Are we eligible? So it's county-owned.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have any kind of formal like lease, or, you know, the questions I would ask is, do you have any kind of formal lease that's at least 6 years? Or do you have some other kind of formal written agreement with the county? If you do have something like that, that maybe isn't a lease, you know, email us afterwards at grants@preservenys.org, and we can talk about it. But yeah, we probably need some kind of, you know, formal agreement between the 501c3 entity and the public governmental entity.
Great, thank you.
All right, good questions. All right, so what work qualifies? So we're saying discrete capital projects. So what does that mean? So again, like I said at the beginning, bricks and mortar projects. You're doing actual physical construction repairs to a building or other type of historic resource. It can be part of a larger rehabilitation project, but the caveat there is that, let's say you're doing, you know, a full building rehab. Let's say it's, you know, a $500,000 rehab project. What we aren't going to do is provide, you know, $20,000 just to go into like a $500,000 total project budget. What you would want to do is take a discrete portion of the work that you're doing and say, this is what we want to apply for. So if you're doing a whole building rehab, but you want to apply to POF to, say, fund the roof, or to fund the window restoration repair, or maybe you've got a Main Street commercial building and you're doing a larger project, but you want to apply to POF to, say, fund repair restoration of the historic storefront, that type of thing. So if you've got a larger project, you just need to carve out some discrete scope of work within that larger scope of work to apply for. Can be exterior or interior work. The work has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. And if you're not familiar with the standards, we'll talk about those in a moment. So just some examples. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the types of work that we could fund, but window repair, masonry work, if you're putting on a new roof, doing roof repairs, if you're doing any kind of structural work, even things that, you know, aren't fun and sexy, like electrical and HVAC, that could qualify. Historic storefront repair, restoration could qualify, and historic finishes like plaster repair or paint. So if you are not familiar with the Secretary of the Interior standards, these are a set of guidelines developed by the National Park Service that all preservation professionals use in planning for and evaluating potential projects on historic resources. We talked about those 3 different treatments earlier: preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation. So there are standards and guidelines for each of those different treatments. So depending on which treatment, which approach your project is, whether it's preservation, restoration, or rehab, you're going to want to make sure that your project meets those standards and guidelines. If you're working with an architect and they're not familiar with these standards and guidelines, you need to make sure that they become familiar with them if you want to apply for this grant program. And Jana, if she hasn't already, will post the link to these standards in the chat that is on the National Park Service's website. And they've got lots of good guidance on what the standards are and what they mean and how to apply them. So
yes,
oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, that link is in the chat, but I just wanted to make sure everyone can see it. Someone mentioned that the chat was disabled. So if you're having a hard time seeing the link in the chat, please let us know.
Yeah, and if for any reason, if we've got a technical glitch and folks aren't able to see the chat, we can make sure that all the information and links we're sharing are on the POF website after the webinar. So don't worry, we will take care of you, and you can also always email us after as well. Okay, so what work is not eligible? Any work that's already underway, that you've already started, is not eligible. Work that's already been completed, not eligible. So, you know, we're not going to give you a grant to kind of pay for work that's already been done. Soft costs are not eligible. So, as well as pre-construction costs. So anything that isn't like actual physical repair, restoration, preservation of physical materials is not eligible. So architectural services, construction docs, specifications, that type of thing. Anything you might be paying your architect to do is not eligible under this program. And then as a 501c3 applicant, we cannot fund any of your admin or overhead or staffing or anything like that. It's really the hard construction costs. Those are the only things that this program will fund. And then we also will not fund new construction or additions. Even though certainly we encourage sensitive additions to historic buildings, this particular program will not fund those additions. And then, of course, as we've already discussed, work that does not meet the Secretary of the Interior standards is not eligible. A few other important details. You can only submit one application per cycle, and we do anticipate, running this program annually. So if you've got, multiple projects in the hopper, it just has to be one at a time, one per year. Again, it really, this program is really designed for shovel-ready projects. And that's because the work has to be completed within 18 months of you signing a grant agreement. So if you're awarded a grant in June and you sign the grant agreement in June, you really have to be able to complete that construction project within 18 months from the day that you sign that grant agreement. So that's why it's really important that it's a shovel-ready project. If you have received prior Preservation League grants, for example, if you've received our TAG grant or a Preserve New York grant, those projects need to have been successfully completed in order for you to be eligible to apply to POF. Also, if you have an open Preserve New York or TAG grant, you have to close that grant out before you're eligible to apply to POF. And then National Register listing for this particular program is not required. Although it's always great if you do have it. So eligible property types, I mentioned at the beginning, these are the different property types the categories that we break down the larger term historic resources. These are the different types of historic resources that we work with in the world of preservation. And all of these different resource types are eligible to apply to our program, which is really exciting because, oftentimes capital grants are only eligible or only allow buildings to apply. So buildings are eligible, and building is basically anything that is used to shelter any type of human activity. So historic houses of worship are eligible, theaters, meeting halls, Main Street commercial buildings. Again, you still have to it still has to be a 501c3 applicant, and they still have to be the owner or have a long-term lease on the property, but any type of building is eligible to apply. Historic sites are eligible. So that might be a place where an important historical event happened. It could be a designed landscape like a garden or a cemetery or a park. And then structures are more utilitarian historic resources like bridges, roadways. If you've got a designed landscape like a park that might have a bandstand, a historic bandstand or gazebo in it, you could apply for funding to repair those. Or even boats or something like a grain elevator would be eligible. And then the last category are objects. These are often smaller and, at least theoretically, you could pick them up and move them. And often they are located within historic sites or designed landscapes. So things like sculptures, monuments, statuary, and fountains. So any of these types of historic resources are eligible to be funded through this program. All right, so the funding info, again, requests have to be a minimum of $10,000, a maximum of $40,000 is the maximum award. Has to be at least a 50-50 cash match. So again, if you're asking for $20,000 grant, you need to be prepared to come up with at least $20,000 additional dollars of your own money. In kind, anything in kind does not count towards match. So, your staff time or something in-kinded by a contractor, that does not count towards match. It has to be a cash match. So dollar for dollar. Your match must be unexpended funds. So you can't, come to us and be like, well, we've you know, we've spent $50,000 on our building and now we want a $10,000 grant. I mean, that's great that you've invested in your building, but for this grant program, what you're asking for, you have to match with money that you have not yet spent. And then the grants will be dispersed at the end of the project when you've received your contractor's invoice. So just to clarify, that's not a reimbursable grant. You don't have to pay for the work and then we give you the grant money. No, we will give you the grant check once you have received your contractor's invoice before you pay it. So that makes it a little bit easier that you don't have to come up with that upfront cash necessarily. Okay, so we have several funding priorities that we'll touch on.
Caitlin,
Yes.
I'd like to pop in with a few questions about the match requirements. So you mentioned that in-kind is not eligible for the match, and we had several of those questions, so we're answering that now, that in-kind is not. Let's see, one of the questions was for the 50% match, can this requirement, oh shoot, that's the in-kind one. Is New York State funds eligible to be used as the cash match?
Good question. Yeah. As long as it's a cash match, your match can come from anywhere. You know, it can come from bake sales. It could come from your own bank account. It could come from private donations, from a foundation, from New York State, from the federal government. It just needs to be a cash match, no in kind.
Great. And how about soft costs? Would those count?
So soft costs do not oh, are you the question is do soft count do soft costs count towards match? Is that the question?
Yes, that's the question.
That's a good question.
Yes, it is.
My inclination is no, but my inclination is no. But again, this is a brand new program, so we don't necessarily have 100% of the answers at our fingertips. So we can certainly clarify that and get that we'll add that information, a clear answer on that. We will add that to the FAQs section of the POF website. But my inclination is that one would need to match with a cash match towards construction costs, but we will definitely clarify that. And thank you for that question.
Well, certainly. And something to keep in mind too, as far as soft costs, is that in order to have a show-ready project, you most likely would already have covered those costs of, you know, architect fees and such. So unexpended money is only allowable for the cash match, not money you've already spent.
And that, yeah, that's a good point. Again, to reiterate, as you see on the slide, the funds that you're using to match, like Jana just said, need to not have been spent yet. Any other match questions?
Let's see. I think that we've answered all the match questions. Yeah, looks good.
All right, keep them coming. Keep them coming, guys. Great questions. Okay, so the funding priorities. So projects that meet any one or more of these priorities will receive priority consideration. You know, gives them a little boost. And you know, it's not that your project has to meet any one or more of the funding priorities, but if it does, great. So the first funding priority are projects that have a history of Preservation League involvement. So that could be maybe your property has been on our 7 to Save list in the past. Maybe you've received a Preserve New York grant or a TAG grant. Maybe you've received multiple Preserve New York or TAG grants. So any kind of official involvement with the league is considered a funding priority. If your project and the subject historic resource benefit traditionally underserved communities, then that is also a funding priority. And I do realize that we don't have a definition of what an explanation of what we define as an underserved community. So we will get that also up on the POF website so that you have that concretely to refer to. The third funding priority are projects that prepare historic sites for the semi-quincentennial of the United States. I had to look up what that was. It is the 250th anniversary in 2026 of the US. So if you've got a project that's preparing a historic site for that anniversary, then that will receive priority consideration. Any projects that incorporate training and apprenticeship opportunities in the preservation trades will receive priority consideration. Getting more, especially young folks, into the trades, getting more people trained, getting more people working in these fields, because we are really approaching a crisis in the preservation trades, with most folks reaching retirement age, and there not being a lot of training opportunities out there. That's a really major priority of the league. So if you've got a project that incorporates trades training, that's a great thing. And then lastly is if you have a project that advances sustainability goals and addresses climate change in some way. Okay, so we'll go through the application process now. Pretty straightforward. Of course, read the guidelines that are on the website and watch this webinar. So everyone who's here, you're already, one step ahead. But do be sure to read those guidelines very closely, because there are some nuances in there that you want to make sure that you're aware of. So the first step, once you've got all that information and you've got your project figured out, is to submit a letter of intent, or an LOI for short. Those are due March 12th. We'll talk more details about that in a second. In early April, after everyone has submitted their LOIs, we will invite a limited number of applicants to submit a full application. And I want to draw your attention to this because this is different than our TAG or Preserve New York grant programs. With those programs, we have a pre-application process where you fill out the application, a pre-app, explaining what your project is, and then Jana, if you're eligible, sends you the link to do the full application. With those grant programs, that's really just determining, are you eligible? With Preservation Opportunity Fund, we're doing things differently. So I want to make sure that's really clear. Just because you are eligible does not mean that you will necessarily be invited to submit a full application. Because we've got limited funding, we're really only going to invite a very limited number of applicants to move on to submitting the full application. And as someone who has filled out many a grant application in my day, I kind of appreciate funders who do that type of thing, because then you don't have to go to the trouble of doing all the work for a full application if you're not necessarily rising to the top of the list there. So just keep that in mind. Just because you submit an LOI and you may be eligible and you may have a really great project, you aren't necessarily going to be invited to submit the full application. We will send those invites out in early April, and we will certainly let you know one way or the other. So for those folks who are invited to submit a full application, that full app will be due April 30th, and then we will announce awards in mid-June. So just to quickly kind of guide you through how the application process works. So again, the first step after you've read through the guidelines is to submit your letter of intent. Again, those are due March 12th, and they are due by 5 p.m. Eastern. So, don't wait until 4:40 to do it. All of the LOIs have to be submitted via our grant portal, Smarter Select. That's really important. I'll walk you through that process in a second. We will not consider emailed materials. Hate to be harsh about it, but it's too hard to keep track of things that are coming in and different things. We are only going to consider things that are submitted via Smarter Select, the grant portal. So if you email Jana or me your LOI, we are simply not going to consider it. And the LOI does have to be uploaded as a 2-page PDF, not a 3-page PDF, not a 2.5-page PDF, not a 4 or 5 or 6-page PDF. It really needs to be limited to that 2 pages. So how do you do that? So if you go to the POF webpage and below the guidelines and FAQs, you'll see this coral colored button that says submit a letter of intent. You click on that and it will take you to the grant portal, which is Smarter Select. This is the page that you'll see. It basically repeats the information that's on the POF landing page about like eligible applicants and eligible projects. You want to scroll to the bottom of that page where you see this green apply button. You can click on that. You can also click on the sign in. They both take you to the same place. So just click on the big apply button, and then that will take you to the sign in page. Now, what can be confusing is that it defaults to the sign in page. And so if you've submitted a tag grant or a Preserve New York grant in the past, you already have a user profile in Smarter Select. So just, go ahead. If you've already applied for a different grant in the past, put your email in, put your password in, and sign in. If you have never applied to the league for a grant, since we've been in this online system, which has been the last several years, if you have not applied to the league for a grant, you're going to want to click on this tab on the left that says create new account. That might not be immediately obvious, so I really want to draw your attention to that. If you've never applied to the league and you haven't used this grant portal before and you don't have an existing account, you're going to need to create a new account. So then click on that create new account, you'll enter your email, you'll create a password, and you'll be good to go. So once you've created your account, if you don't already have one and you've logged in, this is the form that you will see for the letter of intent. The first couple fields are just asking for some basic biographical information. So the applicant organization name, the primary contact. So that's the person we're going to reach out to say, yes, please, we'd like to invite you to submit a full application, or no, we're sorry, not this time. Their email, the name of the historic resource, and the address. So just basic biographical information. Some of these fields, when you hover over them, you'll get a little pop-up that provides you a little bit more background, but it's pretty straightforward what we're looking for there. Then at the bottom of the page is where you can attach your actual letter of intent. And you will see, we'll go through these guidelines, but this enumerates basically everything that we want you to include in that 2-page LOI. So once you've got your LOI, and if you typed it in Microsoft Word, if you've got a version of Word that's 2010 or later, you can easily save it as, export it as a PDF. And then you can click the blue button here and attach that PDF. So I want to really emphasize the system will only accept a PDF. It will not accept a Word document or any other file type. So you really have to make sure that you save it as a PDF, otherwise you're going to be out of luck. And that little instructional pop-up gives you that information. So yeah, you just click on that button and attach your PDF letter. And then at the bottom of the page, you can save the application and come back to it if you need to for any reason, but it's pretty straightforward. You just fill out those few biographical fields at the top and attach your letter. So hopefully you can take care of that in one go. So just to touch on what we're looking for in the letter of intent, we are looking for just a concise summary and introduction to your project. Okay, an LOI is not a full grant application. We don't want to know the full history of your building or resource. It's just a concise introduction to the project so that we can get a sense of, is this a good fit for our grant program? Now, I know it may sound like a broken record, but please do stick to that 2 pages. Anything beyond 2 pages is not going to help you. More is not more. This is not a more is more kind of situation. Less is more. And again, I know I'm being a broken record, but just want to be clear. You will need to save that letter as a PDF. Okay, so these tips are just running through those guidelines that I showed you a screenshot of a few slides ago. So again, we're going to be looking for basic contact information about the applicant in your letter of intent. Just explain that what the applicant's ownership interest is in the property. So you're going to tell us you're a 501c3 and you're going to tell us I own my building, or I have whatever, a 10-year lease on the building with XYZ county, whatever the case may be. So these two pieces of information, that first information, basic information about your organization, that's like a sentence or two. Just tell us your mission and what you do. Again, we're really talking about summarizing and being concise and brief here. So do not give us a paragraph of information about your organization and its history. Just basic info, and then literally one sentence explaining, do you own the property or do you have a lease on it? And then a brief summary about the proposed project. This can maybe be a sentence or a couple of sentences. You know, if it's a simple like roof replacement project, all you need to say is, you know, our roof's in bad condition, we have water infiltration, we're replacing the roof, and this is the material we're replacing it with. So just really cut to the chase and just give us a summary of what the project is. I know some projects are more complex than others, but just be as concise as possible. We're just looking for a summary here. And so within that summary, we do also want just a brief description of the historic resource itself. Again, that's like 1 or 2 sentences. Maybe it's, you just say something like, this is the oldest house in XYZ county, or, you know, this is a former bank building on Main Street in whatever village. And it's 3 stories, and, you know, we have a commercial space on the first floor and 3 floors of office spaces above it, something like that. Really concise and to the point, just painting a really broad picture of the resource. And again, brief description of the scope of work, your estimated total project costs. So again, we talked about these projects really needing to be shovel ready. So chances are, if you're going to be a good fit for this program, you've already done kind of the legwork of either doing a building condition report or working with an architect to develop a scope of work. So you should have some idea of estimated project costs. Doesn't need to be exact, but some estimate. Obviously, let us know how much money you're asking for. It's important. And then let us know how much matching funds, again, it needs to be at least 50%. Let us know how you're getting how you plan to secure your matching funds. Let us know if you have already secured them or if you anticipate and how you anticipate securing them. And then just a brief explanation of how your scope of work was determined. So if you've done a condition report, all you need to say is, we did a condition report in 2019 and it said this was the most important thing, repair item to do. Very simple. And then this is where you might go into just this might be a little bit more lengthy than some of the other items we ask for, is just really briefly explain how it meets the evaluation criteria, which we will touch on in a second. And then let us know if it meets any of the funding priorities. And, you know, my recommendation is don't take up space trying to, like, if it's a stretch to really say you meet a funding priority, don't try and take up space trying to make that stretch. Just, you know, pick the ones that are really strong, really obvious. Yes, we definitely meet this funding priority. A sentence or 2 about why. You know, don't try and fit a square peg into a round hole. So these are the review criteria that we'll use for the LOI and the full application. We dive into this. I'm not going to go into these. They're explained on the POF webpage, so you can take a look at those there. So we've got those 4 criteria, and then of course what also gets factored in is, does the project meet 1 or more of the funding priorities? Okay, so we are almost done, and then we can open it up to any more Q&A. So some of the frequently asked questions we've been getting: do I need to have funding secured when I apply? No, you don't need to have that funding in hand, but you certainly want to make it clear that you have a plan for securing that funding. But also do keep in mind that if you are awarded the grant, you do need to complete the project in 18 months. So, you know, if you don't have the ability to raise those matching funds relatively quickly, then you may want to hold off and apply in a subsequent year. Do I need to have completed a building condition report prior to applying for the Preservation Opportunity Fund? You don't need to, But that's a building condition report certainly lays the groundwork for having a shovel-ready project and certainly shows that, you know, the work you're proposing to have funded is really an appropriate treatment and is really the, you know, highest priority for that property. You know, what we don't want to see is like a situation where someone's applying for funding to repair their plaster, but they have like an active leak or water infiltration issue in their roof. So we really want to make sure that funds are going to, you know, the highest priority items on a building or other type of resource. Now you probably know the answer to this question since I have been heavily repeating it. What if my LOI is more than 2 pages? No, don't write an LOI that's more than 2 pages, please, for your own sake. I know it's a bit of information that we're asking you to squeeze into that 2 pages, but if you're just really concise and to the point and summarizing things, you should be good to go. And you know, please don't, you know, have no margins and like a, you know, size 8 font. Just you know, let's do font size 11 or 12, keep it reasonable, keep the margins reasonable. The goal is really just to be painting in broad strokes a project for us so that we have a general sense of what you're asking and who you are. Can I submit supplementary materials with my letter of interest? No. We're just looking for a brief summary with this LOI. So please do not save your PDF with additional pages of supplementary materials. Please do not email us any other materials. We just want that 2-page basic summary. And again, we already addressed this earlier. Will everyone who submits a letter of intent be invited to apply? No, because the funding is limited, we're only going to be inviting a limited number of applicants to submit the full application. So, you know, don't be deterred if you're not invited to submit the full application. It doesn't mean you don't have a worthy project, and you can come back in a subsequent year. And we already covered this, but just to reiterate, the historic resource does not need to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And again, to reiterate this, can grant funds cover architectural services? No, they cannot. We're really just covering hard costs, construction costs with this grant. All right, and then with that, Jana, if we have any questions, happy to answer any questions. Please don't hesitate. If you've got one, drop it in the Q&A. If you've got a question, chances are someone else probably has that question. We've got a few minutes here that we can certainly address any questions that have come up.
Great. All right, Caitlin, we do have about 20 questions, so prepare
Boy.
yourself. Okay, so there was the question of what are soft costs? So folks are clear on that.
Right. So hard costs are the you know, the what you're paying the contractor to do the project, right? You're paying a contractor to repoint your masonry or to put on a new roof. So their time and materials, the labor and materials, those are hard costs. Soft costs are, you know, things that you might pay an architect to, like maybe you're paying an architect to develop the scope of work or to develop specs for the contractor. Anything that's pre-construction, anything that you pay an architect, you know, acquisition costs, those type of things are not eligible. What's eligible are really just the construction costs that you would be paying a contractor to do the actual physical work.
Great, thank you. Also, how many grants are we awarding in this year?
So that really depends on it depends on the projects that come in through the LOI process and who we invite to submit the full application, and how those applicants, you know, look and you know, whether they meet the priorities, and the review criteria and how the panel evaluates them. But so I can't give you a definitive answer, but it's going to be a limited number of projects because of the funding availability. So, you know, it's not like we're not awarding 20 projects here. It is going to be very competitive, which is why we're doing it this way with the LOI process, so that, you know, we don't have 100 people filling out full grant applications when we just don't have that anywhere near that much funding to give out. So it will be pretty competitive.
And so on a related note, the very direct question of how much total funding is available in this round, we get that question.
Right, so this program, we are going to be funding off of an endowment that we have every year. So we don't have that, we can't give you that exact amount right at this moment in time. But it is going to be, I can just tell you, it will be a finite dollar amount. And it will be, there will be a limited number of applications that will get funded.
All right, so there was a question about the 18-month completion deadline. We were asked to elaborate on that. I'm not sure if you can elaborate on that.
Sure, so let's say we tell you, let's say in mid-June of this year, that you got funding for the project. Let's say we tell you on June 15th, you sign the grant agreement on June 18th. That's when the clock starts. So you have to, hire a contractor, get the contractor out there. The contractor has to do the work and finish the work from 18 months from that day that you signed the grant agreement. Yeah.
Okay.
It can be a challenge. We certainly are sensitive to that. Hard to get contractors these days. So that's why this program is really designed for kind of shovel-ready projects where you already know what your project is. You've maybe already worked with an architect or a contractor to get the scope of work settled. So you're kind of really ready to go. And the only thing that's holding you back is money.
Okay, so we got a couple questions about leases and stewardship agreements.
Okay.
If a current MOU is being renewed, but they don't expect to have it finalized by the application deadline, can they still submit the LOI? Actually, they don't expect to have it finalized by the LOI deadline. Can they still go ahead and submit an LOI?
I would say yes, still go ahead, submit the LOI, just provide a brief explanation, especially if you have, so if you're renewing an MOU, but you had one for the past however many years, just explain that. And just let us know where you are in the process.
Okay, and is there, we've got another question, is a license agreement with a municipality the same as a lease? Do we consider that the same as a lease?
Yeah, I would say yes. Go ahead and certainly submit an LOI and yeah, just explain that you have this license agreement and kind of what the basic parameters of it are.
Okay. And can an organization apply for multiple grants on different segments of a larger project?
No, just one grant. So yeah, if if you've got a bigger project that has lots of moving pieces to it, just pick one of those pieces. If you've got a building rehab and you're doing roofs and you're doing windows and you're doing floors and plaster and masonry repointing, pick one of those things to apply for.
Okay. There were a couple questions about the needed estimates or documentation prior to applying. Do they need to submit any documentation showing the need for the needed repairs, such as an architect's proposal? And do they need to have estimates ahead of time?
That's a good question. I mean, all questions are good questions.
Yeah.
But in particular, for the purposes of the LOI stage, you don't need any kind of backup documentation. Just tell us what that estimated total project cost is, and again, provide a sentence or two explaining how you got that project cost. So you did a building condition report, or you got an estimate from the contractor. That type of thing. So, when we get to the full, if you're invited to submit a full application, then you'll need more documentation and backup material. But for the purposes of the LOI, no, just tell us the number and how you got that number and how you determined what the scope was going to be.
Great. We got a number of questions about eligible projects themselves, specific projects such as the preservation of a pipe organ, if that would be an allowed project.
Yeah, I think anything within the envelope of a historic building that is, an integral part of the building. So, I think the example I often use is like, if you pick up a building and shake it and it wouldn't fall out, then that would probably be an eligible expense or project. So yeah, an organ, as long as it's an integral part of the building, it was built with that organ or the organ was designed specifically around that building, that would be eligible.
Great. And can you explain how you interpret urgency for this project?
Yeah, so we have a little bit of text explaining that on our website. But just let us know, is there some kind of imminent threat against the property? Is there development pressure? Do you have like a giant hole in your roof? That's pretty urgent. Do you have a major structural issue that's unsafe? Those are the types of things that would be urgent. So just let us know what threat the property is facing. And it may not necessarily, you may not necessarily have that urgency, but just let us know, paint a picture of what the situation is. Again, a summary, but yeah. So just kind of giving us a sense of like, well, if we don't get this money, if you're in a situation where like, we don't get this money now, like bad things are going to happen. We would like to know that.
Sure. All right, we got a question about the Secretary of the Interior standards. Our nonprofit has a long-term lease on a historic church that's not on the state national registers. They want to replace their slate roof with an architectural shingled roof. They would preserve the shape of the roof and the copper gutters. Are they allowed to replace slate with architectural shingles?
That's a good, very specific question.
Yeah.
That can always be really tricky. So, the standards, for those who aren't familiar with them, they are kind of general guidelines. So they are very much up to interpretation. And you're going to get a different interpretation from different people. There's oftentimes not one right answer. So, when it comes, especially to historic houses of worship that have very large, oftentimes very complex roofs, sometimes replacing slate with slate or tile with tile is just simply not practical. So I would say we would certainly leave the door open for an application like that. And make the case for the urgency, and for why it's not practical to repair or replace the slate. I mean, in that case, you would want to document that you've had someone who's qualified to assess slate roofs look at it and assess the roof, and they've told you, no, actually, some pieces can be repaired, or no, it really, the slate has met the end of its life and really needs to be wholesale replaced. Definitely in that kind of situation, you want to be able to back up your choices and let us know that like someone with expertise in that material has looked at it and has provided XYZ recommendation.
Wonderful. We're getting to the end of our questions. So there's one about timing and the contractor's bills. So if you have a contractor's bill within the first few weeks of a project, would that meet the terms of this grant? Is it possible to submit prior to the completion of the grant? So can you request grant money on an ongoing basis, I think is what they're asking.
I see what you're saying. Oftentimes you're going to get invoices from your contractor before the project is complete. I would say, that's one of those questions, this being the first time we've run this program, that I don't have a clear answer to at this moment. It's just a good question. Certainly something we will figure out. But I would say, for the purposes of the LOI, this is the stage that we're all at. So don't worry about it for the purposes of the LOI. Certainly, if you got to the point of submitting a full application, we would definitely, figure that out at that point in time.
Okay, great. Let's see, going through a last few, does asbestos abatement work qualify?
Sure.
Great.
Got to do it. So, yep.
Okay. All right. Would installation of an innovative wastewater treatment system for a historic house being rehabilitated be eligible?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, I think that kind of falls under the general category of building systems like, plumbing, electrical, HVAC. I guess I would say if there's some, I don't know what all that work would involve, if it involves the construction of some kind of like ancillary addition or structure, then maybe not. But if it's all contained within the historic existing building envelope, then yeah, I don't see why that wouldn't be eligible.
Okay. If we have funding for 60% of a project and only need 40% to proceed, is there a way to indicate this on the LOI?
Yeah, that's a perfect example of the type of project that this program would really be well suited for. You've already been doing fundraising, you're 60% of the way there, you're 80% of the way there, and you just need a little bit more money to plug that financing gap. Yeah, so just let us know in your LOI. We've been fundraising, our total project costs are whatever, let's say $100,000. We've raised 60,000 and we need 40,000 more to be able to close the gap and get the project off the ground. Just explain that to us. That's great.
All right. And do you anticipate this grant opportunity being available in 2025?
Yes, so this is going to be an annual program. What we anticipate the timeline being moving forward is we anticipate the timeline in the future lining up better with like construction season. So for the 2025 grant, what we will do is probably announce availability of we'll like open the program up for the next round of applications probably in October, November of this year, with the goal of making 2025 awards like very early in 2025, like January, February, so that folks would be ready to go for construction season in the spring.
Great. It looks like we're at the end of our time. It's 1:02. I think we've answered most of the questions. For project-specific questions, you can always feel free to reach out to us at grants@preservenys.org. But it looks like we've covered most of the concerns here.
Great. Thank you, Jana, for tracking all those questions. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I know it's a lot of new information, so if you've got questions, again, don't hesitate to reach out to us at grants@preservenys.org. We're happy to email or hop on a Zoom and go over any specific questions you might have. Yeah, and again, we will get this webinar up on the website within the next day or so you can go back and watch it. And if you do want to claim those continuing education credits, again, reach out to us. All right, thank you, everyone, and have a great day.